Hello, I am Alejandro Rojas, blogger for the Huffington Post, but I am also the Director of Public Relations for the Mutual UFO Network. It's the largest UFO research organization in the country. There's thousands of members and hundreds of investigators all over the country, some outside of the country. And I have with me here Robert Powell, one of the authors of UFOs and Government, and he's also the Director of Research for MUFON. Hello, Robert.
Hi, Alejandro. It's nice to see you today.
Yeah, good to see you too. So I guess what makes you, how did you get involved with MUFON, becoming the Director of Research?
Well, my background is kind of what got me involved. I have a degree in chemistry, and I worked in the semiconductor field for, about 25 to 30 years, working on flash memory devices and microprocessors, and also in a research and development environment. Retired early, and I decided I wanted to really do the things I've always enjoyed doing, and one of those was researching unidentified flying objects.
Cool.
And I knew MUFON was the largest organization. So I joined MUFON, and then within 6 months, a Director of Research position opened up, and I applied for it and was able to get that position with the main goal of improving the use of science in the investigation of UFOs.
Now, you have a lot of co-authors here in the book. The other main co-author is Michael Schwartz, and Michael Schwartz is actually a professor. Is that correct?
Yes, Michael's a professor. His bachelor's degree is also in chemistry, and he's got a master in biochemistry and a PhD in the science of history and technology.
Okay. Now, this book is great. It's humongous, and I like to hold it up so people can see how much larger it is in my head, about twice as big. It's huge, and it's thick, 600 or so pages with lots of pictures. And that's because you all have done a ton of research here. If you look at the end of any chapter, there are pages of references. And these references are just not your typical kind of hearsay. These references are from government sources. And I mean, you guys had a high level of quality in the sources that you put in here.
Yes, that was one of our main objectives right from the beginning, is that we wanted a quality book that looked at the history of the way UFOs and the government interacted. And at each chapter, we have 40, 50, sometimes 60 different primary sources that are referenced at the back of each of those chapters. So these aren't hearsay. These come from actual government documents, and some of the government documents we actually include also in the appendix, the critical ones, so that anyone who reads this book can see those documents.
Mm-hmm. And you have all the, all of the references, so people can go research themselves to see that, this is a real deal. This is real government documents. In fact, you describe this as the UFO phenomena from the government's perspective because you've used so many government resources.
Right, exactly. We look at it from how the government looked at the problem. I mean, today most people think, the government poo-poos UFOs and doesn't consider them a real phenomenon. But that's not the way the history of the phenomenon is expounded, and we show that in the book. It was a serious problem that the government investigated, considered seriously, including the Air Force, the CIA, clear up to the President of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, almost, if not most of this book deals with the United States, although you have other countries in there. But little more than the first half is dealing with the United States and what they did prior to 1969, because in 1969 they stopped their official investigations of UFOs. But there's a lot of stuff. I mean, they really took this phenomena serious, and they examined a lot of very credible cases.
Yes, the U.S. government took this phenomenon very seriously. We begin the book in World War II, when the phenomenon really begins in modern history, which is 1944 or 1945. And at that point in time, what was then called the United States Army Air Corps, which later became the U.S. Air Force, their pilots often in their runs over Europe would see balls of light flying alongside their wings. And at the end of the war, this had happened often enough that the United States government actually sent several scientists to Germany and to Japan to ask their scientists exactly what was that, because we suspected it was some new weapon that they had. And the interesting thing is, when we talked to the German scientists after the end of the war, their response was, well, we thought those were yours. And that's what really began the modern UFO era. It began before the days of Kenneth Arnold. It began in World War II. And that's where the book begins. And at that point in time, it was considered a serious problem, and the U.S. government considered it a significant national security issue.
So much so that even President Truman in the early 50s had asked the CIA to officially look into the situation, which became, at least in UFO research, the infamous Robertson panel.
Right, absolutely. And what's interesting is when you read the history of those days and times, not only did the CIA get involved and the Air Force was involved, but the Navy was involved. And you could see that it was a lot like modern times. All those different government bodies were vying to be the one who was the main investigator of the UFO phenomenon, because they all considered it serious, and they wanted to be who took the ball. Because if there was a critical issue that occurred, the Navy didn't want the Air Force to be the one who did it, and the CIA didn't want the military to be the one, just like what you saw in 9/11. Each one of those government bodies had information in a silo, and they kept it from the other government bodies.
Now, the Robertson panel, what did they conclude? Because their conclusions were pretty important, right?
Yes, the Robertson panel, which was actually initiated by both the CIA and the Air Force, although primarily the Air Force, they concluded basically two things. One, that UFOs were not a national security issue. In other words, they felt it was not a threat to the United States. And the second thing they concluded, which was very important, was they felt that there was a potential psychological issue, and that there could be a security issue if another government used the UFO phenomenon as a weapon to divert the U.S. citizenry and government in the event of a foreign attack. So those were their two main points that came out of the Robertson panel. One thing to be noted that everyone should realize, the Robertson panel never said that UFOs did not exist, only that they did not believe them to be a national security issue.
And that's mainly because a lot of these cases, like you review here, didn't result in any sort of attack by any unknown object that they saw. A typical report was they see something, they maybe try to catch up with it to see what it is, and it takes off at a fast rate of speed.
Okay. Not only was there no aggression displayed by these unidentified flying objects, there's a case, and we show it in the book, and this is a case I don't think anyone has found in the past, and we dug this out of some special documents at Texas A&M University, where we have an incident where a Boeing engineer who was operating a radar system for the Army in New Jersey in 1952, he gives a case where not only did they load their artillery shells to fire on UFOs, but the Air Force loaded their aircraft with missiles to fire on these UFOs, and they were given the order to do so. But despite that, no aggression ever came back towards the United States. We were the only ones that were ever an aggressor towards these UFOs. Now, this tells you something, because it tells you if our government is willing to fire on something, they don't think it's a radar blip, because this is over a highly populated East Coast city area. You don't order artillery shells and missiles to be fired on an object that you don't think is real.
Right. So moving on, because of course there's a lot more, people can look at the book to get more info. The Air Force eventually gets out of the business of at least officially investigating UFOs in 1969. And that's where the conspiracy begins, because of course some people say, oh, that was just a cover, where they really just went underground and there are these secret organizations that do this research. I mean, what did you find? Did you find that it was just too much of a hot potato for the Air Force, or did they in fact, do some sort of, create some sort of group to do this in a more secretive way?
Well, all military organizations have a primary objective, and that is the national security of the nation they represent. And once the Air Force determined that there was not a threat to national security, and at the same time, they could not figure out exactly what the phenomenon really was, it became a hot potato for them. They wanted the monkey off their back because they're not a scientific organization. Their job is not to research phenomena that cannot be determined. Once it was not a national security issue, they did not want to have to deal with the problem. And if you put yourself in the shoes of the Air Force, why would you want to go to the American public or Congress and state that there was a real physical phenomenon in our airspace that we could do nothing about, and they would work on it as they could? They're not going to do that. So what they did is they initiated the Robertson panel, and they got the monkey off their back and basically wanted to discontinue research into the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Given that, however, you do have a chapter that goes on to after 1969, and there are some apparent UFO investigations by the Air Force. It sounds like, one of the cases that you all highlight, which is really interesting, was where the government was forthcoming with a lot of documents about some sightings at Loring Air Force Base.
Right. Loring Air Force Base, Barry Greenwood did some very good research. He's one of our authors, and he has a book called Clear Intent, which goes into very detail on the Loring incident. Even though I indicate that the Air Force wanted out of the business, they still are responsible for the national security of the United States. So when you have an unknown object near a U.S. military base, it must be investigated, because initially they don't know what the cause of it is. It could be Soviet at that point in time when the Soviet Union existed. It could have been any number of threats, and they can't simply discard it. So it was critical that they investigated that in that instance. And all the indications we have is that the U.S. government still will investigate unidentified flying objects, because if you think about it, every object that initially shows up on radar that's not with a transponder and that they're aware of is an unidentified flying object in the beginning. So until they can identify whether or not it's a threat, they're going to investigate all unidentified flying objects. The difference that happened after 1969 is that they no longer would categorize and keep files on unidentified flying objects which remained unidentified.
Mm-hmm. And before I move away from the United States and get into some of the interesting foreign governments and what they're doing, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Stephenville, which of course you had a great involvement with, where you, along with Glenn Schwartz, were able to uncover get some radar data from the FAA, which showed that there was an unknown object on FAA radars in the area of Stephenville during those popular sightings that happened in 2008.
Right. We go into a little more detail in the book on exactly what happened in 2008, and we go into detail on how we had radar data, for example, where there was a constable who saw an unknown object, which he said was approximately 2 miles south of his home, and on radar there's an object 2 miles south of his home. And these objects were witnessed by over 20 people within a 4-hour period of time, and not at just one location, but at multiple locations across those 4 hours. And I would say this case in Stephenville is one of the most interesting cases in the history of the study of UFOs. It ranks along with the RB-47 case back in the 1950s and the Alaska airline case back in the 1980s. There are several cases we go through in the book which have never been answered or solved to this day.
Mm-hmm. And then, it seems that as opposed to necessarily that the Air Force essentially with those cases says, we don't know, and then they move on, and they just kind of don't like to highlight these cases, these instances where they don't know what happened.
Right. And, I think a little bit of that is psychological. And I've talked to a lot of people that were in the military, and I asked them, well, do you report something like this when you see it? And almost always their answer is, no, I didn't report it, it's just going to be a black mark on me. People are going to think I'm crazy. So why would I report this? So they'll report it later on after they're gone from the military, but they don't want to report it while they're in the military. And that's pretty much the attitude today as compared to the 1950s and 60s when military officers were ordered to report UFO sightings. While today there's this underground, don't report this if you want your career to continue.
Now, this phenomenon has been taken very seriously in other countries, and in fact, there are some countries right now that have official UFO investigation organizations, some tied to their military, some tied to their version of the FAA. Who are some of these countries and more impressive projects that are going on?
We go through quite a few countries that have some very interesting methods of how they investigate UFOs. Sweden's one of the countries we go through. What's interesting about Sweden is that the military works with the civilians. It's not a two groups that are working against each other. They work together, unlike the current method in the United States. Another country we look at it, France. France is very unique. It's the only one country in the world that I'm aware of where rather than having a military organization within the government look at it, which is going to look at it from a national security aspect, they actually use their version of NASA, CNES, which uses scientists to actually investigate the UFO phenomenon. So France is actually looking at the phenomenon from a totally different perspective than most of the other nations of the world. They're looking at it from a scientific aspect, not a military aspect.
What I think is interesting, too, with France is that, for instance, I know with you don't like to jump to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that's what the answer is to the UFO phenomena, because UFO stands for unidentified. We don't know what it is. But in the reports from Japan and France, they include that they at least have not excluded that answer, and they don't have to throw that in there. But it's interesting that they do.
Yeah, Japan and France, because it's a scientific body, they look at it more open-minded, and they're just trying to investigate. And if the investigation leads them to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that's fine. They're just looking at what is the most likely answer to the phenomenon. But the French have really done some great work. I mean, they've taken 2 landing site cases where they've looked at the constituents that are in the soil, the chemical makeup of the plants, and how the change in chlorophyll changes when you went from the center of the landing site to the exterior of the landing site. I would say the French have done some of the best work probably in the study of the phenomenon.
Well, and in these 2 cases that you speak of where there was a lot of scientific work done there, do you feel the evidence in those cases shows that something strange did happen?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. The French have the photographs of the landing site. That's in the book. We show the photos of the landing site. We give indications of what they found in the soil. For example, the French looked and found that there were no petrochemical byproducts in the soil. So that told them immediately that this was not created by someone with a vehicle or anything along those lines. So they really did some good analysis. They brought out scientists to actually sample the area, and the gendarmes, their version of a national police force, actually cordon off the area to prevent contamination of it. So they take the problem much more seriously than we do in the United States. I mean, their government is directly involved. As an example, we give a case in the book where an individual tries to hoax a UFO sighting. The gendarmes come to investigate. They determine it's a hoax. They put the guy in jail. The French don't really mess around with it. They consider it a serious issue. They don't laugh at the witnesses, and they don't expect the witnesses to hoax a UFO.
Well, that's cool. That curbs the hoaxing, I'm sure.
Yeah, it curbs the hoaxing a lot.
And there are also a lot of organizations in South America. I mean, that seems to be a concentration of official organizations.
Oh yeah, there's some great Brazil. We talk about Brazil in the case. They've got a great organization down there, and then there's other organizations because we don't have time to talk about all of them. But one, for example, Chile has a good organization. Peru doesn't have as dedicated an organization, but there's some very interesting cases that occurred in Peru, including a pilot who actually goes up and fires his I don't remember if it was 90 millimeter cannon or what the millimeter was, but he fires his cannon into a UFO and the bullets go through the UFO.
Wow.
As if it wasn't really there.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my final question, because I think you've definitely really piqued the interest, I'm sure, of people in the about the book. What makes the book so important and unique? I mean, what inspired you guys that you had to do this?
I think what makes the book so unique that someone who buys the book will really appreciate is that the authors of this book, several of them have spent decades at the National Archives, at the Air Force Archives down in Montgomery, Alabama, at using FOIAs to get information from the FBI, the CIA, and the Air Force. Several of the authors, I would say, have spent 30 to 40 years of their life thoroughly investigating this phenomenon. These aren't people who are jumping to conclusions. So we don't talk about aliens. We don't talk about necessarily what's the cause. We talk about how the government reacted to the phenomenon. And it's a real reaction. It's a serious reaction. And this reaction probably still goes on today, but not in an open forum as it used to do.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. It's UFOs and Government. Published by Anomalous Books, and they can find it on Amazon, right?
Amazon, and they can find it there as well as BNN.
Okay.
Barnes & Noble.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, Alejandro.